representing 2 to 7% of the Pentagon's annual budget, and with a projected lifetime cost of over $1 trillion, the Joint Strike Fighter program, with its 3 variations of the F-35 airframe for the U.S. Air Force, Navy, and Marines in over a dozen partner countries, is the most expensive weapon system in history. For point of contrast, World War II cost the United States an inflation-adjusted $4 trillion and was finished in 4 years, less time than the initial phases of development for the Joint Strike Fighter, which has taken over 20 years. Critics of the program are numerous, but when faced with the choice of scrapping the program and potentially having to spend even more money versus attempting to fix what is already existing, the United States government has decided to stay the course. Tonight, we are joined by a former Lockheed employee and F-35 representative to discuss why the program has run into so many problems, what could have been done better, and how this fits into the overall warfighting capability of the United States and its allies.
Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
The military-industrial complex.
But we are here to destroy the control over the industry of other people.
I did not trade arms for hostages.
Ich bin ein Tier.
На полный разгон выносных захватчиков.
Milita Fabde tu intiv sinci Pascal.
Hello and welcome to the Myth of the 20th Century. Today we are joined by a very special guest, Matt. He's a former Lockheed employee. We're going to be talking about the F-35 program. But before we jump into that, I have a Bitcoin donation I'd like to thank real quick from the wallet, starting with the characters 1NDY. And then let me introduce my co-hosts, Nick.
Hello.
Hank.
Good evening.
And Hans.
Good evening.
And Matt, thanks for coming on.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So where to begin? This is the most expensive weapons system in history. Very difficult to get started, but in my research of this, it's kind of interesting to note that this was developed, the program for the Joint Strike Fighter, the F-35, made by Lockheed Martin today, was developed after the Gulf War, and apparently stealth was the kind of primary advantage that was sought after the F-117 made its debut in combat and was flying over Baghdad during the night, and all those very famous images of anti-aircraft fire going off into the sky through night vision, obviously, and you could see basically just this giant cluster of neon tracers going up in the sky, not knowing where anything was, basically because they were unable to lock into the F-117s that were dropping bombs onto key targets in the capital of Iraq. And that was decided to be a great piece of technology, and they wanted to seem to roll that out. And they were actually unwilling, apparently, to fly F-16s over Baghdad during the day because they were worried that surface-to-air missiles would hit them. And F-16 is a traditional, agile-designed fighter jet that I believe was made by General Dynamics, but its main purpose was dogfighting and air-to-air combat, as opposed to the F-15, which is more suitable for air-to-ground attacks, carrying a bunch of bombs, basically. But the F-16 was super maneuverable, but it had basically the radar signature of like a house. And so it's very easy to pick up on. And with the advances in some of the Russian surface-to-air missiles, the Pentagon wanted to put stealth on its fighter jets, which the F-117 technically, and I've argued this multiple times in the show, is not, because it cannot do any dogfighting. It basically just can carry a couple bombs and that's it. So that's kind of the backdrop to this whole program, and it slowly kind of got rolling in the 90s. But Matt, you tell us, you were actually at the Fort Worth plant in Texas where they make these things. So what do you know about why this thing got started, and what do you have to say about it?
Well, the first thing I'd have to go back to the late 1960s during the Vietnam War, where you had basically the F-4 Phantom, which was basically the precursor to the F-35, is what we were pretty much instilled with. You had basically, they would always say, like, if you have a big enough engine on anything, you can make it fly. And that was basically the F-4 Phantom. And during that time, McNamara was basically, one of the Pentagon's whiz kids. He'd come from, I think it was General Motors or Ford, one of the automotive manufacturers.
It was Ford.
And it was Ford. Okay. He came from there, and he was basically just, you talked about Taylorism before. Basically, that was McNamara. Like, let's streamline absolutely everything we can. Let's streamline it, and, try to collect statistics on it and do everything we can to, make the best fighter plane ever or whatever. And it was basically a scientific or mathematical approach to warfare. So that was the F-4 Phantom. It was in the Air Force, the Marine Corps, and the Navy. Started out as a Navy plane, and the Air Force eventually adopted it. So that was really the precursor to it. Like, anything that you can do to get a big fleet out there, reduce the logistics cost, which is absolutely critical, to any program like that. So that was the F-4 Phantom. The F-4 Phantom, obviously, there was a lot of air combat doctrine that had really slipped in the early 1960s, right after Korea. And they basically had a real dependence upon non-visual combat. So they had really relied upon the F-4 Phantom, to take out targets beyond visual range. And they really took a lot of casualties with that.
This is the intro screen of Top Gun.
Right.
Yeah, they mentioned that they were not using the guns. That was Tom Skerritt's line, but they were using missiles instead. So you're saying that
right.
that was deemed insufficient, or what is your contention?
My contention was, the technology at the time was not capable at that time to do beyond visual range. I think it's called BVR.
BVR,
yeah. Combat. And especially when you're in the jungles of Vietnam, there's a lot of heat coming off the jungles, and that can really, bamboozle,
Sensors.
your sensors. And at that time, that was even before the Apollo program, when they first, started, operations over in Vietnam. You're talking about, technology that is less powerful than, a TI calculator that you have today. So the F-35 program really, you're talking about the Gulf War and everything like that. The F-16 is a great dogfighter. One thing you have to keep in mind about the F-16 is it's got one single engine. It's like a lot of like the MiG-21 fish beds, during the Vietnam War. It's very nimble. It's got a very, that was really, I think, one of the first fly-by-wire aircraft that was out there. So, it's technically, it's not flyable without that computer there.
Right. As opposed to the older system where it was mechanical linkage. You're using basically electronics to send instructions to the engines, the ailerons, all the different control surfaces on the airplane. So you need that computer and all the electronics to be functioning.
Right. And the F-15 actually came before the F-16. And there's a lot of talk about the fighter mafia.
Pierre Spray.
That came before that. Yes. He's got some good points and some bad points. But, I don't really know the history and the ins and outs of what happened before that. But, with the F-15, you basically have 2 engines. You have 2 F-115 engines where I think they're Pratt & Whitney F-115 engines on the F-15. With the F-16, you have 1 of those. But the big advantage that the F-15 has is it's got a lot longer of a range and carry a whole lot more missiles. And it can basically hang around a target longer. And it's got a lot of power. But where the F-16 comes into play is with, the maneuverability and plus the cost too. To fly an F-16 is a lot, to operate an F-16 or fly one is a lot cheaper. It's a lot easier to fly one of those compared to an F-15.
Do you know why it's cheaper?
Just look at it. Really half the cost of most of these fighter jets is in the engines. That's a big player right there.
Okay.
Because the engines, it takes a lot of really skilled maintenance or just manufacturing, to build one of them. It takes you're talking about spewing, hundreds of gallons of jet fuel into one of these suckers.
Yeah, just as a frame of reference, big rig trucks carry about 300 gallons of diesel fuel. I don't know exactly how many gallons fighter jets are carrying, but if nobody's ever actually gotten up close to one of these things, they're not small. They're really big. They're really big vehicles. I would even say it's comparable to the size of a tractor trailer. They're probably bigger than that actually. And most of it is basically just the engine, the wings to hold all the fuel, the tails, and then you have a little room left over for basically the actual weapons. But it's basically a weapons delivery platform, and you got to go really far, really fast, and the faster you go, you're basically going up against turbulence and friction, and it's you're burning a lot more fuel the faster you go, just like in cars, I would assume. Yeah.
And one thing, basically, you described it pretty well. It's basically a flying engine, with some computers on board. If you look at the F-16, or let's just talk about, the F-35. The F-35 carries, they always talk about pounds, when you're talking about aircraft, when the fuel consumption. That's everything to them. It's not about, they don't talk about gallons, they talk about pounds. But, for, reference, I'll talk about gallons right now. The F-35, I believe, carries 1,800 gallons of fuel. And if they were completely what you would call naked, no weapons, no external fuel tanks or anything like that, they can basically fly for about an hour and 15 minutes. That's how much fuel you burn.
Without the aerial refueling, obviously. But that's only possible if you have, air superiority. And so if you're going over a target like Russia, you're screwed and you basically can't get in there. So you have to, Iraq, we killed everything. So it was easy to probably do that. But, excuse me for cutting you off, but I just wanted to add that in because it's a huge point, to decisions of where you can deploy these things.
Yeah, 17, I think it's like 17 or 1,800 gallons, and that'll last you about a little over an hour. So, you're talking about huge fuel consumption. And I get those numbers from the training aircraft that we had set up, initial training operations with the aircraft.
Yeah.
So,
is that one of the bigger problems with the F-35 is that the fuel consumption is at a rate that makes it very difficult to use it in combat with highly advanced nations the way that it was sort of designed to be used for?
No. That's all jet fighters. If anything, it's probably less than, some of the legacy aircraft that you had before. That's all jet aircraft fighters.
The problem with the F-35 is mainly the cost. It's in the complexity. It's not so much the plane is terrible per se. I think they will get through it. This is my bias coming out, but just after watching the thing, it seems to be getting better. We can get into